Okay, well, thanks for the invitation, and really thanks for your presentation. It was really very inspiring. And I realized that you just did it from my laptop, so I have a copy. I hope you don't mind. It's very, very nice to see it again. The question I was posed was not, I didn't have a list of questions to answer, actually. I had just one major question, which is this. Is there any way of feeding the world and preserving biodiversity and ecosystems? And well, I mean, actually, and many have already said something about this, I don't believe it's possible to feed the world without preserving biodiversity, right? Now, it's good perhaps to start from the very beginning of things. How did we come to this situation? And when I say the beginning, I mean the beginning. I mean from the Earth, when the Earth started, 4.5 billion years ago. From here is better. And if you look at this clock, actually, well, photosynthesis started somewhere there. 60 million years ago, we had the forest, the rainforest, and only in the last second of this clock is where humans appeared, right? Only 2 million years ago. The forest was already old when we appeared on Earth, and most of our time we were hunting, gathering, walking around, changing the ecosystem, disturbing other species, competing with other megafauna. We are megafauna, and megafauna is anything between a sheep and an elephant, so we qualify. And at some point, in the last 6,000, 7,000 years, we decided to become sedentary, to start building camp and to start doing agriculture. And that was actually the first population boom 7,000 years ago with sedentarization. Agriculture was a very, very successful strategy as a species. Right? It started everywhere at the same time, right? Without any connections. It was a very, very successful strategy. And, well, our expansion went at the expenses of the other species that were occupying the same niche as we were, right? So the number of megafauna species started to decline as we increased. Not only because of us, there was also climate change, right, at the time. And scientists are very interested in this part of the history of the Earth because it's a combination of climate change and population growth. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like what's happening today. So it's very interesting for us to understand what happened. And what we see there is actually when instead of numbers, we put biomass of humans and megafauna, we see a replacement, actually. But when we also include the megafauna that we call livestock, actually we see that we are completely out of balance. If this is the Earth carrying capacity of megafauna based on solar energy, look at where we are today. We're here, right? And how is that possible? That actually started after the Industrial Revolution with the use of biofuels. Fossil fuels. Coal and oil and gas, basically. With that, we were able to actually use energy that was already stored in the planet so many million years ago. And we're still using it. But this is not really sustainable. So that's the point where we are today. And worst of all, this is not feeding the world. Because today we are producing enough food, thanks to that way of producing, but we have 1 person in 8 in the world who's hungry, right? Almost 1 billion people in the world are still hungry. And when we look at statistics, we see that in the last 20 years, for instance, when we look at the world scale, actually, sorry, it's very small lettering, but nothing really changed in the last 20 years, right? And in many parts of the world, we see in the last 50 years a dramatic increase in food production, yields in agriculture, but in many parts of the world, certainly in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're at the same levels as we were in the 60s. Nothing changed there. And the food that is produced in Illinois or in Arkansas or anywhere else is not necessarily going to the hungry people in Malawi. It's actually used for other things. For instance, to feed livestock. Right? The main driver of deforestation in the Amazon is soybean production, to feed livestock, not to feed people. Now, the problem is that we not only have a problem with hunger in the world in terms of distribution of wealth and all that, but also a problem with obesity, with overconsumption or consuming the wrong thing. And obesity is a major problem today, more than hunger, actually. There are more obese people than there are hungry people. And because there are so many claims for food, prices go up and they go in peaks, and every time there is a peak, there is a riot or there is a political problem. Like the Arab Spring is a latest example. A lot of food which is being produced is wasted. We're producing it and we're not using it, and we waste it in different ways. But for instance, if we take only post-harvest storage of food, like in the case of India, where they produce a lot of wheat, now they lose 21 million tons of wheat per year because of poor storage conditions. 21 million tons of wheat is equivalent to 20 times the production of wheat in the whole of the Netherlands. 20 times the production of wheat of the whole of the Netherlands. So you see, it's a huge amount. Now, because land is necessary, we have deforestation of land that before used to be considered marginal for agriculture, like the Chaco forest in South America, where now soybean is expanding, and with enormous consequences for the environment, for biodiversity, and for people living there. And because all this carbon ends up in the atmosphere, we have then the problem of climate change, accelerated climate change, among other things. Now, 25% of the land in the world is currently degraded, in a severe state of degradation. This is all agricultural land. So this is bad news, but this is also good news, because that means that if we find a way to recover that land, we get 25% more area to grow crops. And so we reduce the pressure on the forest. And if we restore productivity in those soils, we are also going to sink a lot of carbon in those soils, which is also going to contribute to climate change mitigation. And then we hear discourses, people saying, well, the best way to go forward with food production is to actually intensify, to produce high-tech, high yields. And what we see is that actually what we are seeing now in terms of expansion of oil palm plantations, particularly in Peru, we see that actually it's not true. Actually, high-yielding schemes are expanding in the virgin forest, whereas low-yielding schemes, more related to land-sharing schemes, are expanding on degraded land, which is what we want. So actually, this discourse needs to be put on the table and debated. Now, let me show you some examples of biodiversity at work. I normally say that to find solutions for the problem of food in the world, we need to do 4 things. We need to learn from nature, we need to be inspired by local knowledge, we need to make use of biodiversity, and we need to make use of the newest knowledge and technologies available. This is a picture that comes from Sahel, from south of the Sahara in Africa, from Niger in particular, and this is an agricultural field. This is a normal field of millet and cowpea, right? These are very harsh conditions, very poor soils, very hot temperatures, little rainfall. And in those conditions, these crops produce primary productivity levels of 1 or 2 tons per hectare per year, right? But if we look at the savanna next door, just a few meters away, we see 10 to 20 times more biomass. So nature has found a way to produce a lot of biomass in very harsh environments. So perhaps we should actually learn from these structures and functions in nature to inspire our agricultural systems. And this is a picture that comes from my previous job. That's why it's in French. And we were developing these systems for Madagascar, actually, inspired in the structure of the local vegetation and designing cropping systems which are complex, cropping and livestock systems, based on the structures and functions of the original vegetation. Now, Cuba, as you know, well, this is a guy who I don't know what to think about. It's called Fort Denison. It will take me many, many minutes to explain what I think about him. So let me just skip it. And this is an image that shows how Cuba did it. As you know, Cuba was cut off from the Soviet Union in the 90s, and that means that they didn't have any oil, any fertilizer, any pesticide, any inputs. So they had to go organic by default, right? So they had to go into agroecology. They had to start using the knowledge of nature to develop cropping systems to feed themselves, right? And they did it, and we can learn a lot from them. Now, most of the diversity that Hans was showing us in his analysis, in his pictures, is actually very beautiful. But we also have some diversity which is less sexy, but very important, right? And this is soil diversity, and we need that diversity. This is a diversity that we find in any agricultural field, not in any agricultural field, because actually we see that the way we manage those agricultural fields influences the diversity in the soil. This is an experiment done nearby, here in Utrecht province, where we were looking at how different ways of managing the soil affected soil life, and we were looking at the home field effect. We were finding out that actually when farmers use the manure from their own cow, it decomposes faster in the soil than when they use manure from their neighbors, right? There is a coevolution of the bacteria in the rumen of the cows and in the soil that allows these faster decomposition rates. So this is a very interesting finding. And already 10 years ago, people showed that when you manage the soils as organic farmers do, actually you increase the physical properties of the soil, the physical quality of the soil, and that brings along more diversity in terms of microbial diversity, but also faunal diversity in the soil. And if we look at, on top of the soil, we look at the herbs. Very often we see these herbs growing along ditches, and we see that cows, which are grazing, they go nearby and they start eating from those herbs, which are not there for them, but they like them, right? So we started doing a study in a number of places together with the Louis Bolk Institute, in which we looked at the medicinal herb richness of grasslands. So we look at herbs in grasslands and their medicinal properties, and then we follow this dairy systems for about a year, 30 of them, and what we found is that the more diversity we saw in the grasslands, the less antibiotics were necessary. Now, this is empirical. We don't have the mechanism behind this yet. We have a number of hypotheses, but this is very exciting preliminary results, in which, again, biodiversity helps. Now, you know what this is. These are the roots of a legume plant. A legume. A legume is a big family of plants, and they live in symbiosis, not all of them, but they can live in symbiosis with bacteria, rhizobia, and those bacteria, they host themselves in these nodules, and they fix nitrogen from the air. They do the same job as the fertilizing industry does, but they do it for free. But not for free. They need some sugars, etc. And when we mix those legumes with cereals like maize, like in this example from Mozambique, we see that actually we see huge increase in productivity in cereals, thanks to the nitrogen fixed by the legume, right? So this is very interesting. Nature has developed a way of bringing nutrients from the atmosphere to the soil, and we are underexploiting it in agriculture. If we compare what we measure in natural systems versus agricultural systems, we're actually not using it enough. Grasslands in many parts of the world, especially in the south of South America, natural grassland with high diversity. These are hotspots of biodiversity, and they produce a lot of meat. A lot of the meat, the famous meat from Argentina and Uruguay, is produced on this natural grassland with lots of diversity. And this grassland, this diversity, actually is very important because these are very erratic, climatically erratic situations where you can have droughts and floodings and everything else, but you always have grass. This diversity is very important, and these multiple ecosystem services need to be considered when we evaluate agricultural production systems. This is a picture from Kenya, from the highlands of Kenya, where we see, in spite of all the green that you see there, this is farmland. People are living there. 1,000 people per square kilometer are living there and farming. And yet, you see a lot of perennial biomass there. So what we did is try to estimate the amount of carbon stored in the above-ground vegetation in those farms and try to relate that with, sorry again for the small lettering, with biodiversity. In short, we find a very strong relationship between diversity, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration potential above and below ground. And unfortunately, when we try to develop a project to get people to access a Kyoto Protocol quota, we found out that it was not possible because in the Kyoto Protocol, the left-hand side scheme is eligible, but the right-hand side diverse farmland is not eligible. Right? People use diversity in different ways, and this comes also from the Sahel. These are shrubs that grow during the dry season with residual water. They have very deep roots, and some of these shrubs are legumes also. They also fix nitrogen. Now, people normally use these shrubs at the beginning of the season because, well, obviously they use them for cooking, for as firewood, etc. Livestock don't like them, so they are always green. And what you see is underneath the crown of these shrubs, you see a lot of biological activity. And that creates islands of fertility, islands of biological activity that actually favors plant growth. So people cut those shrubs and they plant crops on those islands. And then they harvest the crops and the shrubs resprout. And this is something that's been happening for many years. And now what we're trying to do is to optimize this system. Learning from local knowledge, using nature, using biodiversity to optimize production systems and produce more food in those areas. This is a famous picture. These are famous systems of Faidherbia or Acacia albida, which is pandemic in Africa. I mean, no, pandemic is not the word, but you can see it everywhere in Central and Eastern and Southern Africa. And this is a legume tree, and it goes very well with maize. When you grow maize under the tree, you get greater yields than when you grow it away from the tree. And that's because this plant has an inverse phenology. Actually, during the dry season, it has leaves, and during the wet season, when you have your maize, it loses all the leaves, so there is no competition. There are two different niches are being used by these two species. And so the idea is, can we actually use these concepts or these ideas to develop systems for Europe, for instance? How would agroforestry look like in Europe? Well, in fact, when we look carefully, actually, agroforestry does exist in Europe already. And you'll be surprised if you read this book already from 5 years ago, in which they compile all the examples of agroforestry in Europe. There is huge potential to combine species and to increase diversity in European farmland. Why do we want more diversity on European farmland? Well, because diversity brings more diversity. And in this particular case, it brings useful diversity, like arthropods, that are very useful as natural enemies and also very useful as pollinators. Now, the economic value of pest control that we get for free from all these insects is estimated to be around 400 billion dollars per year. Right? If we think about pollination, we talk about $120 billion per year. And that's thanks to the diversity of arthropods in the agricultural landscape. Now, when we work in a greenhouse, we can actually buy a kit with insects, and then we release them in the greenhouse, and they will control the pest. That's how they do it in the greenhouses in the Netherlands, in many other places. When you work in the open field, you can't do that. You can't just release them. So you have to actually create the conditions for them to come. So what we do is, well, of course, we do the opposite, which create the conditions for them to go away. But we need to start looking at the landscape with the eyes of these insects. If you need nectar to survive, then this landscape on the left-hand side actually looks like the landscape on the right-hand side, upper one, for a nectivorous insect. If you need to eat aphids, well, it looks like that, right? So with this information, we can design landscapes which are actually better suited to host diversity and to control pests without pesticides. So this diversity can help us. And that's what we're doing here. This is an image from the Hultsevaar. I hope I pronounce it well. Near Rotterdam. Okay, so in that place, what we're doing is inventorizing all these habitats to understand how habitat structure affects the life and the reproduction and survival of all these beneficial insects. And so each point there is actually part of a database that we would like to expand it to a national level. And there we have all the information about species diversity, but also the dynamics, because it's important to know in time when exactly is this a suitable habitat for a natural enemy. Otherwise, it will not be there on time. It will not be effective in controlling the species that you want them to control. Right? And flowers are very important. It's good to have flowers in the landscape, but not any flower, because the insects have a certain morphology of their mouth parts, which needs to fit with the morphology of the flower. So you also need to know exactly which flowers and when. So this calls for ecological engineering at the landscape level. But when you work on the landscape, you're not dealing with a single farmer. You're dealing with a community of farmers and a community of people who care about this landscape and have claims on the landscape. And so you need to engage those stakeholders in participatory process and in negotiation. And how do we want this landscape to look like? If we think in terms of aesthetic reasons, but also in terms of natural enemies and the like. So sometimes it's very useful to use models, but not just simulation, mathematical simulation models. I mean actual models. Let people model together and negotiate on the structure they want in their landscapes, the services they want. I said land sharing, land sparing. As you may imagine, I'm always generally inclined to be in favor of land sharing, of course, but it's not always possible. You can't share land with elephants. You can, but it's hardly difficult, right? So in this case, we were working in Zimbabwe, and we were looking at how could we intensify agriculture to save space for the elephants and to avoid cropping in their corridors so we wouldn't have damage or risk to human lives. And, well, we use also models in those cases, the models that we use for discussion. Basically, with these kind of models, which are called agent-based models, actually allows us to quantify, don't mind about the numbers, but basically allows us to quantify what we call trade-offs. So we can, with this kind of quantification, we can talk to conservationists, to village elders, or to the government and say how many kilos of grain you would lose per hectare you give to nature, or how many animals more you can have or not per elephant that you save. So actually those numbers are very important in negotiations. This is another example. This comes from Mexico, also from another thesis from our group. And Erika Spillman has been looking at this biosphere reserve in Chiapas. As you know, Chiapas is a very contested area. And there's a community living around that biosphere reserve. And many of their activities are not really compatible with nature conservation, biodiversity conservation. But also there's a lot of conflict among themselves. And in those cases, it's very useful to also use games and let people play to understand the logic or the way of thinking of decision-making of each other. And for us, it's very important because when we develop models of plant growth, ecophysiological models of plant growth, our parameters are the specific leaf area or the shoot-root ratio, these kind of things. But when you're working with communities, community decision models, your parameters are leadership, communication, collaboration, etc. And these games allow us to get information of those parameters and then translate that into quantifiable outputs. So what we need is a new design of farming systems. It is possible to farm with nature. It is necessary to farm with nature. Nature doesn't stop at trees and birds. Nature is also soil diversity, insect diversity. We need design, and when we need design, we need to work with people who know how to design. This is an example from a very young group of landscape architects who came with a very good idea that we're going to present in Brussels next month. And it's the idea of organizing agriculture around rivers, alongside rivers. And this is the example of the River Rhine from the Netherlands to Switzerland, or the other way around. And alongside the River Rhine, we can actually have all the ecological niches necessary to produce almost all the food we need, right? And the transport is guaranteed through the rivers and through the existing railroad networks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes a lot of sense from the sustainability point of view to regionalize food production in these kind of units. It's good to let your imagination fly a little bit and start imagining a different future, a different way of producing food, and certainly to connect nature to urban areas. Right? The average distance that our food travels is 4,000 kilometers. When you go look at all the products you see in the supermarkets, the average distance they have traveled is 4,000 kilometers. We can't do everything locally. We can't grow bananas in the Netherlands, right, or coffee. But at least we should try to be as local as possible. And actually, if you do this, if you bring agriculture production closer to cities, you can actually recycle a lot of the waste, what contains a lot of energy and nutrients that otherwise is not being used back in the land, right? Okay, to bring human waste 4,000 kilometers back to where food was produced is uneconomical, but if food is being produced close to the cities, that is possible, right? There are very good examples already in small municipalities around the world where they're doing this. In China, they're designing big food parks to be able to recycle the excess water and the excess garbage into nutrients and energy for food production. So this is all possible, this is all happening. And there are people with really very good initiatives, even here in the Netherlands, although you wouldn't expect to find this kind of developments, agroforestry developments, food forest development, very interesting, very innovative. I was invited in December, was it, to participate in this conference, Rethinking Agricultural Systems in the UK, and it was really very interesting, and I hope we can hold something similar here, and really be able to think freely outside the box. How would we like agriculture to look like in the future? Right? There is a conference this Friday and Saturday, actually, in Wageningen, to which I invite you because some of these issues will be discussed there, and many people working on these innovations will be present in that conference. So for that, I think I've reached the end of my presentation. Yes? Thank you very much.